The moment everything stopped. The church had never held so much power within its ancient walls. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, their light catching the gold thread woven through expensive suits and designer gowns. 400 guests sat in polished mahogany pews. Politicians, businessmen, judges, and criminals. All of them pretending to be one and the same. Armed guards stood at every entrance, their presence as natural as the white roses that cascaded from every pillar. At the altar, beneath a stained glass window depicting salvation, stood Alessandro Vitali, the Mafia Boss of the Eastern Syndicate, a man whose name was whispered with fear across 3 countries. A man who had built an empire on blood, silence, and calculated ruthlessness. A man who, at 42 years old, had finally decided to take a wife. Not for love, never for love, for alliance, for legacy, for the appearance of normalcy that would protect his operations for another generation. His bride, Isabella Marchetti, stood across from him in a gown worth more than most people's homes. She was beautiful, composed, and perfectly aware that this marriage was a transaction. Her father's shipping routes in exchange for Alessandro's protection. A business deal wrapped in white silk. The priest's voice echoed through the sacred space. Alessandro Vitali, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part. Alessandro opened his mouth, and the church doors burst open. Every head turned. Every guard reached for their weapon. But Alessandro didn't move, because standing at the entrance, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, was a ghost. Elena, his Elena, the woman who had vanished from his life 5 years ago without a word. The woman he had searched for across continents. The woman he had eventually forced himself to forget because remembering her was a kind of death he couldn't survive. She looked older now, thinner. There were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. Her dress was simple, worn at the edges. She held no invitation, no weapon, no apparent power. But she held something far more dangerous. A child. A boy, perhaps 4 years old, with dark curly hair and olive skin. He clung to his mother's neck, his face half hidden against her shoulder. Then slowly, carefully, the boy turned to look at the crowd, and Alessandro Vitali felt his heart stop. The boy had his eyes, not similar, not reminiscent, identical, those deep brown eyes that Alessandro saw every morning in the mirror. The same slight furrow between the brows, the same shape of the jaw even in miniature. The child looked at him, and somehow, impossibly, the boy seemed to recognize something too. 400 people held their breath. The priest stammered, "Signor Vitali, do you?" Alessandro raised his hand. One gesture. That was all it took. The church fell silent. The ceremony stopped. 400 witnesses, dozens of armed guards, one waiting bride. All of it froze in place. Because in that moment, Alessandro Vitali understood something that changed everything. That child was his, and nothing else mattered. The man before the crown. To understand what happened in that church, you must first understand what Alessandro Vitali was before he became who he was. He was born in a small village in southern Italy, the son of a butcher who couldn't afford to feed all 7 of his children. By the age of 12, Alessandro was running messages for local criminals, not because he was evil, but because his younger siblings needed to eat. By 16, He had proven himself useful enough to be noticed by the Vitali family, the ruling syndicate of the Eastern Territories. They gave him a new name, a new purpose, and a new father figure in the form of Don Enzo Vitali, the aging boss who had no sons of his own. Alessandro learned quickly. He learned that mercy was a weapon to be used sparingly, that trust was a currency more valuable than gold, that in their world, showing weakness was an invitation to death. By 25, he had risen through the ranks with a cold efficiency that terrified even his allies. By 30, when Don Enzo died of a heart attack, Alessandro was the natural successor. He took the throne, and he paid the price. Friends became liabilities. Relationships became leverage points for enemies. The few times he tried to get close to someone, a business partner, a woman, a childhood friend, they either betrayed him or were killed to hurt him. So he stopped. He stopped feeling, stopped hoping, stopped pretending that he could have what normal men had. His penthouse was magnificent and empty. His bed was cold. His meals were taken alone, surrounded by guards who feared him too much to speak. Alessandro Vitali became a perfect machine, efficient, ruthless, untouchable, and completely, utterly alone. Then Elena appeared, the woman who shouldn't have mattered. She was nobody important. That was the first thing Alessandro noticed about her. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, Elena wanted nothing. She worked at a small bookshop in Rome, a dusty little place tucked between a bakery and a tailor's shop. Alessandro had ducked inside to avoid surveillance from a rival family, and he found her sitting behind the counter, reading a novel, completely unaware that one of the most dangerous men in Europe was standing 3 feet away from her. "Are you looking for something specific?" she asked without looking up. "Privacy," he said. She glanced at him then, took in his expensive suit and cold expression, and simply shrugged. "The history section is in the back. Nobody ever goes there. No fear, no recognition, no agenda." He should have left and never returned. Instead, he came back the next day, and the next, and the next. For 3 months, Alessandro Vitali sat in the history section of a tiny bookshop, pretending to read while watching a woman organize shelves and recommend novels to elderly customers. He learned that she laughed easily, that she gave discounts to students and free books to children, that she believed in kindness even though the world had given her little reason to. When he finally asked her to dinner, she said no. "You seem like someone with too many secrets," she told him. "I've had enough of secrets." But he persisted, not with gifts or power, but with presence. He showed up. He listened. He let her see glimpses of the man beneath the armor, the boy who had once loved his siblings more than his own safety, the young man who still sent money to his mother every month without anyone knowing. And slowly, Elena fell in love with him. Not with Alessandro Vitali, the Mafia boss. With Alessandro, the man who quietly read poetry when he thought she wasn't watching. The man who remembered her favorite flower. The man who held her like she was something precious instead of something to be used. For 18 months, they built something beautiful in the shadows. She knew who he was. He never lied about that. But she believed in him, believed that love could change him, could save him, could build a bridge between his darkness and the light she carried so effortlessly. He began to believe it too. He started planning how to step back from the daily violence, how to shift his operations toward legitimate businesses, how to eventually maybe become the kind of man who deserved her. And then one morning she was gone. No note, no warning, no explanation. Alessandro searched for her with every resource at his disposal. He sent men to every corner of Europe. He called in favors from police commissioners and rival families alike. He spent a fortune and sacrificed sleep and sanity. Nothing. Elena had vanished as if she had never existed. After a year of searching, Alessandro forced himself to stop. He told himself she had left because she finally understood what he was. That she had realized a monster could never be saved. That her love had limits, and he had exceeded them. It was the only explanation that made sense. So he buried his heart beneath his empire and told himself he would never be that foolish again. 3 years later, he agreed to marry Isabella Marchetti. A transaction. Nothing more. Until the church doors opened. The truth that breaks and heals. The wedding was immediately suspended. Alessandro didn't explain himself to the guests. He didn't offer reassurances to his stunned bride or her furious father. He simply walked down the aisle toward Elena and the child, his guards parting before him like water. Up close, the resemblance was even more undeniable. The boy had his eyes, his chin, his hands. But he had Elena's mouth, her gentle expression, her way of tilting his head when curious. "His name is Marco," Elena said quietly. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "He's 4 years old. He's yours." Alessandro felt something crack inside his chest. "Outside," he said. "Now." He led her to a small garden behind the church, where ancient olive trees provided privacy from the chaos they had created. His guards formed a perimeter, keeping everyone else at bay. When they were finally alone, Alessandro turned to face her. "Why did you leave?" It wasn't a question. It was a wound that had been bleeding for 5 years. Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Because if I stayed, they were going to kill you." The words hung in the air between them. "Who?" "Caruso. Alberto Caruso." Alessandro's blood turned cold. Caruso had been his lieutenant at the time, his trusted advisor, his friend, or so he had believed. 3 years after Elena disappeared, Alessandro had discovered evidence that Caruso was working with a rival family, planning a coup. Alessandro had dealt with him accordingly. But he had never known the full extent of the betrayal. "He found out about us," Elena continued, her voice breaking. "He came to me and showed me photographs of you, of your safe houses, of your routines. He said if I didn't leave quietly, he would use me to destroy you, that your enemies would kidnap me, torture me, use me as leverage. And when you came to save me, because he knew you would, they would kill you." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "He gave me money, documents, a new identity. He said if I ever contacted you again, he would know. And he would finish what he had started." Alessandro stood frozen, years of buried grief and anger colliding with this new understanding. "You could have told me. I would have protected you, protected us." He said that's exactly what you would try to do. That your love for me would make you reckless. That you would walk into whatever trap they set because you couldn't stand the thought of losing me. She looked up at him with those eyes he had never forgotten. He was right, wasn't he? You would have come for me, no matter the risk. Alessandro couldn't deny it. He remembered those months of searching, the desperate, irrational decisions he had made, the way he had exposed himself to danger again and again, just for the chance of finding her. Caruso had known him well, too well. "So you ran," Alessandro said slowly, "to save me." "I ran to save you, and then I discovered I was pregnant." Elena clutched Marco closer. I had nothing. No money, no friends, no safe place. Caruso's funds ran out within a year. I worked whatever jobs I could find. I hid. I survived. And I raised our son alone, because I believed it was the only way to keep both of you alive. Alessandro looked at the boy in her arms. His son. For years of birthdays he had missed. First steps he had never seen. Words he had never heard. A lifetime of moments stolen from him by betrayal and love. Why now? He asked. Why come back? Elena's expression crumbled. Because I'm dying. The weight of time. The diagnosis was leukemia. Elena had discovered it 8 months ago, when exhaustion and bruising had finally driven her to a doctor. The disease was advanced. Treatment was possible but expensive, far beyond anything she could afford while staying hidden. She had spent months trying to find another way, trying to protect her son without exposing him to his father's dangerous world. But in the end, she realized there was no other option. I need you to take him, she said. I need you to protect him, not because you owe me anything, but because he's innocent. He's good, and he deserves a chance. Alessandro listened in silence as she explained everything. The small apartment where they lived. The jobs she had lost when she became too sick to work. The fear in Marco's eyes when she couldn't get out of bed. When she finished, Alessandro was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. You kept my son from me for 4 years. Yes. You let me believe you left because you didn't love me. Yes. You suffered alone when I could have helped you. Yes. He stepped closer, and for the first time in 5 years, he touched her face. And you did all of it because you loved me. Elena closed her eyes, leaning into his palm. You should hate me, she whispered. I should, he agreed. But I spent 5 years hating myself instead. I think that's enough hate for both of us. He looked at Marco, who was watching him with cautious curiosity. Hello, Alessandro said softly. Hello, Marco replied. Are you my papa? The word cracked something open in Alessandro's chest. Something he thought had died long ago. Yes, he said. I am. Rebuilding from ruins. The wedding was cancelled. Isabella Marchetti left the church in fury, her father's alliance crumbling with every step. Alessandro knew there would be consequences, business complications, diplomatic fallout, possibly war with the Marchetti family. He didn't care. For the first time in decades, he had something more important than power. Elena was moved into the finest hospital in Europe that same day, with specialists from 3 countries consulted within the week. Alessandro spared no expense, leveraged every connection, and called in every favor. But leukemia doesn't negotiate with power. The disease was far advanced. Treatment slowed its progress but couldn't stop it. The doctor spoke in gentle terms about quality of life and making the most of time. Alessandro understood what they meant, so he did something he had never done before. He stepped back. For the first time in 20 years, he delegated his business operations to his underbosses. He stopped taking meetings with criminal enterprises and started taking walks in the park with a 4-year-old boy who asked endless questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly? Why do people get sick? What happens when someone dies? Marco asked the hard questions with the innocence of childhood, and Alessandro answered them as honestly as he could. Sometimes people get sick because their bodies get tired. Will Mama's body get tired? Alessandro hesitated. Then he knelt down to look his son in the eye. Yes, Mama's body is very tired. but we're going to make sure she rests. And we're going to love her so much that she always knows how important she is. Can you help me with that? Marco nodded solemnly. I can help. Good boy. The months that followed were the most painful and beautiful of Alessandro's life. He sat by Elena's hospital bed while she slept. He read to her when she was awake. He held her hand through treatments and setbacks and brief moments of hope. And he learned how to be a father. He discovered that Marco loved dinosaurs and hated vegetables. That he was afraid of thunder but brave about needles. That he laughed exactly like Elena when he was truly happy. They built a life together, the three of them. Not the life Alessandro had imagined in his darkest years. Not the life Elena had dreamed of when she first fell in love. But something real, something precious, something worth every moment of pain that had led to it. The last gift. Elena died on a Tuesday morning in spring. The sun was just rising, casting golden light through the hospital window. Alessandro was holding her hand. Marco was asleep in a chair nearby, exhausted from his vigil. She had been fading for days, her body finally surrendering to the disease that had fought so hard to claim her. But her eyes were clear as she looked at Alessandro one last time. Thank you, she whispered, for forgiving me, for loving him. Thank you, he replied, for keeping him safe when I couldn't, for coming back when it would have been easier to stay hidden. She smiled weakly. I had to see you. One more time. Had to know he would be okay. He will be. I promise. I know. Her hand tightened briefly on his. You were always capable of love, Alessandro. You just forgot how. Don't forget again. I won't. She looked toward Marco, her son, her reason for living, her final gift to the man she had loved enough to sacrifice everything. Tell him I loved him, she said. Every day. Tell him I was proud. Tell him. Her voice faltered. Alessandro leaned closer. I'll tell him everything, he promised. Every story, every memory. He'll know exactly who his mother was, how brave she was, how much she loved him. Elena smiled one last time, and then she was gone. A new life. 5 years later, a man and a boy walked along a beach at sunset. The boy was 9 now, tall for his age, with his mother's gentle smile and his father's serious eyes. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers in one hand. Do you think she can see us? Marco asked. Alessandro considered the question. He wasn't a religious man. He had done too many things to believe easily in heaven or redemption. But over the years, he had come to believe in something. I think love doesn't disappear, he said finally. I think it stays with us, in our memories, in the way we live our lives. So yes, in a way, I think she can see us. Marco nodded, satisfied. He walked to the water's edge and released the flowers into the gentle waves, watching them float toward the horizon. I miss her, he said. So do I. But I'm glad I have you. Alessandro felt his throat tighten. He put his arm around his son and held him close. I'm glad I have you too. They stood there together as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Behind them, a simple beach house waited. Not a penthouse, not a fortress, just a home. Alessandro had sold most of his empire over the years, keeping only enough to ensure security and comfort. He had made enemies along the way, lost old allies, faced threats from those who saw his retirement as weakness. But he had kept his promise to Elena. He had loved their son. He had taught Marco kindness and strength. He had shown him how to be honest in a world full of lies. He had built something he never thought possible for a man like himself. Family, a future, a reason to live that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with love. As they walked back to the house, Marco slipped his hand into his father's. "Papa." "Yes. I want to be like you when I grow up." Alessandro stopped walking. For most of his life, those words would have been a curse. He had done terrible things. He had been a terrible man. The last thing he wanted was for his son to follow that path. But then he looked down at Marco's earnest face, and he understood. His son didn't see the mafia boss. He saw the man who read him bedtime stories, the man who made pancakes on Sunday mornings, the man who had given up an empire to walk him to school every day. "You're going to be better than me," Alessandro said softly. "You're going to be everything good about your mother and none of the bad things about me. And I'm going to spend every day making sure of that." Marco smiled, Elena's smile, and held his father's hand a little tighter. "Okay, Papa, but I still think you're pretty good." Alessandro laughed. It was a strange sound, coming from a man who had spent so many years in darkness. But it was real. It was earned. And as they walked into the house together, father and son, the last light of sunset fell across them like a blessing. What remains? Years later, people would sometimes ask Alessandro Vitali about his life. The journalists who occasionally tracked him down. The old associates who wondered what had happened to the feared boss. The curious strangers who recognized something in his weathered face. He never told them much. But if they asked the right question, if they asked whether he had any regrets, he would think for a moment. He would remember the blood on his hands, the lives he had ruined, the years he had wasted chasing power that never satisfied him. And then he would remember Elena, the church doors opening, a small boy with his eyes, the moment everything changed. "I have one regret," he would finally say. "I spent too many years believing I couldn't be loved, that I wasn't worth saving, that the darkness inside me was all there was." He would pause, looking at whoever had asked. "I was wrong, and the only tragedy is that it took me so long to learn it." Then he would return to his quiet life, to his son who was becoming a good man, to his small house by the sea, to the memory of a woman who had loved him enough to sacrifice everything, and to the knowledge that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something better with whatever time you had left.